The cruelty did not arrive with a shout. Shouts could be dismissed. Shouts left the room with the person who made them. What Sir Oswin Brackley delivered that evening was far worse. A judgment wrapped in silk, given with the soft voice of a man who had never once been made to account for the damage his tongue caused. It was the 14th of October, 1887. The charity ball at Ravensmere Hall in the West Riding of Yorkshire was, by every outward measure, a magnificent occasion. The great hall had been dressed with autumn garlands of copper leaves and white chrysanthemums. 3 chandeliers dripped with candlelight above a floor polished to a shine that caught every hem, every buckle, every careful step of the 140 guests who had come wearing their finest and their most composed expressions. The string quartet was playing Haydn. 2 footmen in powdered wigs stood at attention near the refreshment tables. The air carried the scent of beeswax candles, warm punch, and something floral that the hostess, Lady Harrington, had ordered brought in from the orangery. Mrs. Elspeth Wycliffe entered alone. She always entered alone now. She wore a gown of pale blush silk, not new. The fabric had been let out at the waist and taken in again at the bodice to fit the body that grief and hardship had slowly reshaped over. 5 years, the lace at her cuffs was cream rather than white. Her silver-brown hair had been pinned with care into a neat coil at the base of her neck, held with 2 tortoise-shell combs that had belonged to her mother. She carried no fan. She wore no jewels except for a small oval locket on a thin gold chain, pressed close to her collarbone, beneath the neckline where it could not be seen. She was 49 years old. To the room, that was its own kind of scandal. She had not wanted to come. The letter from Lady Harrington had arrived 3 weeks prior, written with enough warmth and personal appeal that refusing would have felt ungrateful, even unkind. Lady Harrington had been one of perhaps 5 people in Yorkshire who still extended to Elspeth the basic dignity of an invitation. She had pressed her gown. She had polished her shoes. She had pinned her hair with the same steady hands she used for everything now, slow and deliberate, because hurry led to mistakes, and mistakes gave people more to say about her. She walked in with her chin level and her eyes forward. She did everything correctly. Sir Oswin Brackley noticed her the moment she crossed the threshold. She felt it before she saw it, the particular quality of being watched by a man who has already decided what you are worth, and is simply waiting for his audience to settle before he makes the declaration. Oswin Brackley was 58 years old, a magistrate of considerable standing and even more considerable self-regard. He wore a black evening coat tailored without a single unnecessary crease, a white cravat arranged with the precision of a man who had a valet for that specific purpose, and gold cufflinks that caught the light every time he lifted his glass. His silver hair was swept back from a wide forehead. His whiskers were groomed to a sharp point. His smile had been perfected over decades of public life. Pleasant on the surface, dismissive underneath, he moved through society as though it were a property he managed, assessing, calculating, deciding at each turn who was useful and who could be safely reduced. He stepped forward. His voice, when he spoke, was not raised. It did not need to be. The string quartet had paused between movements. The nearest 30 guests had naturally fallen quiet. He turned to the 2 gentlemen beside him, but angled his body so the words carried wide. "Poor Elspeth Wycliffe," he said, with a sigh that managed to sound almost tender. "Too old to be admired, too poor to be welcomed, and too broken to be repaired. One must wonder who still sees fit to invite her." He laughed softly. 3 people near him laughed also. The others simply looked away, which was, in its own manner, the same thing. Elspeth stood still. She had become very good at standing still. It was a skill no one taught you and everyone eventually needed. The ability to absorb a wound in public without allowing your face to show the bleeding. She breathed in through her nose, slowly, and she looked at a point just past Sir Oswin's left shoulder, and she waited for the music to start again. It did not start. Because the great double doors at the far end of Ravensmere Hall opened instead, the crowd shifted before anyone fully understood why. It was an instinct, the kind that belongs to rooms full of people who are accustomed to power, and know without being told when something more powerful than them has entered. The Duke of Hawthorne walked in wearing black from collar to boot. He was 38 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair, and the kind of face that was not immediately handsome, but immediately commanding. A jaw cut clean, grey eyes that moved through the room without warmth or hurry, a posture that suggested he had walked into every room he had ever entered already, knowing he would be the most important person there, and had long since stopped finding it interesting. His name was Alaric Pembroke, and the room both feared and respected him in equal measure, which is the only kind of respect that lasts. He crossed the hall without greeting anyone. He walked directly to Elspeth Wycliffe, and then, in front of Sir Oswin Brackley, in front of Lady Harrington and her 140 guests. In front of every person who had just heard the words, too old, too poor, too broken. The Duke of Hawthorne lowered himself to one knee. He held out his hand. In his palm lay a small, blood-stained locket, not Elspeth's locket, one she had never seen before, but somehow, impossibly, with a cold certainty that moved through her like the first breath of winter air, she knew it mattered. The room had gone completely silent. Sir Oswin Brackley's smile had not yet caught up with the rest of his face. Greetings, noble viewers, and welcome to Forbidden Palace. I trust this day finds you well and in excellent spirits, as we journey toward the grand milestone of 1,000 subscribers. Your support means more than words can properly express. If tales of courage, injustice, hidden truth, and love that arrives in the most unexpected hour speak to your heart, be sure to subscribe. Leave a like upon this video and join the growing court of loyal viewers who gather here. Before we continue, we would love to know, from which corner of the world do you watch, and what hour does the clock strike in your land at this very moment? Drop your answer in the comments below. Every single one of you is seen, and every one is welcome here. Now, without further delay, let us return to our story. To understand what the Duke's gesture meant to Elspeth Wycliffe, you must first understand what the 5 years before it had been. Her husband, Dr. Edmund Wycliffe, had been a country physician of modest means and considerable decency. He had served the mill workers of the Calder Valley for 20 years, treating fever and broken bones, and the chronic lung damage that the cotton dust left behind in men who could not afford to stop working long enough to get better. He had charged what people could pay, which was sometimes nothing at all, and he had kept his accounts in a small green ledger that Elspeth had found after his death, filled with entries like Hargreaves family, 3 children treated, payment waived. Widow Norcliffe, medicine provided, no charge recorded. He had been good, and that, in the end, had been his undoing. In the spring of 1882, the Yorkshire Mill Workers' Relief Fund, a charitable organization that collected donations from wealthy landowners to provide medicine, food, and support to injured workers and their families, had been discovered to be missing a very large sum of money. £420. Gone. The trustees were furious. The donors were outraged. Someone had to be named responsible, and quickly, before the scandal spread further than Yorkshire. Dr. Edmund Wycliffe had been the fund's appointed medical officer. His name was placed at the center of the accusation. He died 3 months later, in August of 1882, of what the death record described as a sudden inflammation of the heart. He was 51 years old. He had never been formally charged, never tried, never convicted of anything. But the accusation was public knowledge, and in Yorkshire society, accusation and conviction had always occupied the same moral territory. Elspeth was left with the house, the debts, and the name. She had sold the house within a year. She had paid the debts within 2. The name she could not sell, and no one was offering to take it from her. She had survived on the small income from a needlework arrangement with a dressmaker in Harrogate, and on the quiet charity of Lady Harrington, who sent food hampers at Christmas and wrote warm letters in the winters when Elspeth's fuel ran low. She lived in a rented cottage at the edge of the village and kept her garden in order, and her curtains clean, and her grief where company could not see it. She had asked for nothing. She had received nothing. Until the evening a duke knelt before her in a ballroom and held out a locket that changed everything. Educational note. In Victorian England, a public accusation without trial could destroy a person just as thoroughly as a conviction. The law offered no remedy for reputation. Those with money hired solicitors. Those without had only their dignity, and that too could be taken. Alaric Pembroke, the 5th Duke of Hawthorne, was not a man given to theatrical gestures. Those who knew him, and few knew him well, would have called him disciplined, perhaps cold. He had inherited the dukedom at 22, when his father died of a stroke on a grouse moor in Scotland, and he had spent the 16 years since managing his estates, his tenants, and his affairs with the kind of focused efficiency that left very little room for anything else. He did not attend the season. He did not keep a mistress. He did not gamble. He had once, in front of 2 members of the House of Lords, called a prominent banker a fraud to his face, calmly and with evidence, and the banker had lost his position within a fortnight. He was not liked by everyone. He was respected by nearly everyone, which he considered the more useful of the 2. He had come to Ravensmere Hall that evening for one reason only. He had received intelligence 3 days prior that Mrs. Elspeth Wycliffe would be in attendance, and he needed to speak with her about a locket that had been found in the personal effects of his late sister. Lady Rosamond Pembroke had died in the spring of 1882, the same spring the charity fund went missing. She had died at 26 of a fever that came on quickly and took her in 9 days. She had been buried at the family chapel at Hawthorne, and her room had been closed, and the Duke had not spoken her name in public for 5 years, because speaking it in the wrong company would have given away what he knew, and what he knew he had been quietly, methodically investigating ever since. He crossed the room to where Elspeth stood, still absorbing the sting of Sir Oswin's words, still holding herself together with both hands. He went to one knee. He heard the intake of breath from 30 people around him and paid it no attention. "Mrs. Wycliffe," he said, in a voice low enough to be private, but steady enough to be heard. "My name is Alaric Pembroke. I have something that belonged to your husband, and I believe you may have something that belonged to my sister." He opened his hand. The locket in his palm was oval, gold, with a faded red stain along one edge. A small enamel rose was set into the lid. Elspeth's hand moved to her own throat, to the locket beneath her neckline before she could stop it. The Duke saw the movement. "Yes," he said simply, "that is the one I mean." Behind them, Sir Oswin Brackley set his glass down with rather more force than he intended. They spoke in the library. Lady Harrington had offered it with wide eyes and a trembling eagerness to be useful, closing the door herself and stationing a footman outside with the calm authority of a woman who had hosted enough secret conversations to know how to manage the geometry of them. Elspeth sat on the edge of a wing-back chair near the fire, her hands folded in her lap, her expression composed. The Duke stood with his back to the mantel, turning the locket in his fingers, and then he began to speak. Lady Rosamond Pembroke, he told her, had not died of a simple fever. She had been, in the months before her death, quietly gathering information about the Yorkshire Mill Workers' Relief Fund. Rosamond had been a woman of fierce conscience and considerable intelligence, one who had learned to operate beneath the notice of men who would have stopped her had they known what she was doing. She had befriended the mill workers' wives. She had reviewed the published charity accounts and found discrepancies that no one else had thought to look for. She had begun to trace those discrepancies as to a source. She had also, at some point during those investigations, met Dr. Edmund Wycliffe. They were not romantically connected, the Duke said, before Elspeth could form the question. I want to be clear about that. My sister was not that kind of woman, and from what I understand of your husband, he was not that kind of man. They were two people who had independently found the same trail and began cautiously to walk it together. Elspeth was quiet for a moment. Edmund never told me, she said. He was protecting you. The same way Rosamond told me nothing until it was too late to ask. He held out the second locket, the blood-stained one. This was found sewn into the lining of Rosamond's winter travelling coat, which was stored in a trunk in the attic, and not discovered until last month. It is not hers. The initials engraved inside are E.W., your husband's. I believe he gave it to her as evidence, something to hold that connected what they had found to a real person, in case one of them was silenced before the other. Elspeth reached out and took the locket. She opened it. Inside the lid, in Edmund's careful hand, were 4 words: Brackley, the ledger, hidden. She looked up at the Duke. Sir Oswin Brackley, she said. Sir Oswin Brackley, he confirmed. The fire crackled between them. Outside the library door, the string quartet had resumed playing, and the sound of Haydn came through the wood like something very distant and very ordinary, which felt, at that moment, completely impossible. The Duke arranged for Elspeth to be brought to Hawthorne House 3 days after the ball, under the pretext of a consultation regarding a charitable initiative, a fiction that satisfied the servants, and would, if repeated in society, be plausible enough to withstand casual inquiry. Hawthorne House sat on 200 acres of moor and parkland in the North Riding. It was a grey stone building of considerable age and even more considerable silence, the kind of house that had absorbed generations of formality and let very little warmth accumulate in its walls. The entrance hall was hung with portraits of previous dukes, all of whom appeared to have perfected the same expression of polite disapproval. The corridors were wide and cool, even in October. The carpets were excellent and extremely quiet underfoot. Elspeth was shown to a sitting room where a fire had been lit and a tea tray arranged, and she sat there alone for 11 minutes before the Duke arrived. He came in, removed his coat, and went directly to the tea tray. He poured himself a cup, took 1 sip, and frowned. This is cold, he said. It was not cold when it arrived, Elspeth told him. Then it cooled while I was delayed. Then perhaps the lesson, she said carefully, is not to leave guests alone with their tea for 11 minutes. There was a pause. The Duke looked at her with an expression that was not quite surprise, but was adjacent to it. You counted, he said. I was raised to arrive on time, she replied. It became a habit to notice when others do not. He was quiet for a moment. Then something shifted very slightly at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the outline of one, as though the full version was simply out of practice. I will ring for fresh tea, he said. Thank you, Your Grace. They worked for 4 hours that afternoon, spread across the sitting-room floor with old records, charitable account books, and a map of the Calder Valley mill districts. The Duke had 3 years of carefully gathered documents. Elspeth had 5 years of memory and the precise, detailed knowledge of a woman who had lived inside the accusation and learned every corner of it by necessity. Together, they began to see the shape of what had been done. Educational note: charitable organizations in Victorian England operated largely without independent oversight. Trustees appointed by wealthy donors were rarely audited. The absence of public accountability created ideal conditions for financial abuse, which affected some of the most vulnerable communities in industrial Britain. The hidden ledger was not dramatic to look at. It was a small, worn book with a brown leather cover and brass corner fittings, the kind used by solicitors, clerks, and estate managers, and men whose work required the careful tracking of numbers. Inside, the handwriting was neat and compressed, the columns ruled in pencil, the totals checked twice. It had been found by the Duke's land steward inside a false back panel in the writing desk of the late Sir Reginald Moss, who had served as treasurer of the Relief Fund until his death in 1884, and who had, it appeared, been far more careful about keeping records than anyone had suspected. The ledger showed, with painful clarity, where the £420 had gone. Not into Dr. Wycliffe's pocket. Into accounts connected to Sir Oswin Brackley, routed through a series of payments to fictitious contractors listed as providing services to the fund. A glazier who had never repaired a single window in a single mill. A carter whose invoices were written in the same hand as the fund's own records. A medical supplier whose address resolved to an empty building on the edge of Leeds. Elspeth found the name of Edmund's legal clerk buried in the middle pages. A Mr. Wilfrid Pargeter, listed as a witness to 3 of the contracts. She recognized the name. A thin, anxious man who had come to the house once after Edmund's death, white-faced and sweating, and said nothing meaningful before leaving in a hurry. "He knows," she said. "He has always known," the Duke agreed. "The question is whether he can be made to say so. He is frightened." "Frightened people talk," the Duke said, "when they become more frightened of silence than of speaking." He looked at the ledger page again, then at Elspeth. "Your husband found this ledger first, didn't he?" he said. Not a question. Elspeth closed her eyes briefly. "I believe so," she said. "He came home one evening in February of 1882, and he was quiet for 3 days. I thought it was a difficult patient. I did not press him. He always came back to himself eventually." She paused. "He did not come back to himself that time. Not fully." There was a silence that was neither awkward nor comfortable, simply the space that honest grief requires. "He was trying to protect you," the Duke said. "He was trying to protect everyone," Elspeth said. "That was always Edmund's difficulty. He believed he could carry things alone." The occasion was a supper assembly held at the home of Lord and Lady Fairborn in the 2nd week of November. A gathering of perhaps 60 guests, formal in dress, and largely predictable in conversation, which was exactly the kind of event the Duke normally declined. He attended this one because Elspeth was attending, and because it had been 3 weeks since Ravensmere Hall, and because certain people in the room needed to see them together in public, for reasons that had as much to do with strategy as with anything else. That, at least, was what he told himself. Elspeth arrived in deep blue, a gown she had altered from an old evening dress by adding a new bodice and freshening the skirt with a band of dark velvet ribbon at the hem. It was not new, it was not fashionable, it was quietly, stubbornly elegant, and on her it worked in a way that 3 of the younger women in the room found deeply confusing. The Duke found her near the punch table. He did not announce his approach. He simply arrived beside her and she turned and looked at him with the calm of a woman who had spent enough time in uncertain situations to stop being startled by them. "You look," he said, "like someone who is calculating how quickly she can leave." "I am also calculating whether the punch has been watered down," she replied. "It has, significantly. Lady Fairborn is an economical hostess. Lady Fairborn is also watching us from across the room, with an expression that suggests she suspects we are conspiring." "We are conspiring," the Duke said. "Yes," Elspeth agreed, "but one likes to be subtle about it." When the quartet began a slow country dance, the Duke set down his glass and offered his hand. It was not a request, precisely, but it was not an assumption either. It was the hand of a man waiting to see what she would do with it. Elspeth looked at the hand. She thought of every reason to say no, the whispers that would follow, the conclusions that would be drawn, the ways in which being associated publicly with a duke could either protect her investigation or expose it. She thought of Sir Oswin Brackley's voice. Too old, too broken. She took the Duke's hand. They danced. He was not a light dancer, but he was a controlled one, which suited her well enough. She had been a very good dancer once, before the years between then and now, and she found that the knowledge was still there, simply waiting. Several younger ladies stared. Lady Fairborn nearly dropped her lorgnette. When it was over, the Duke returned her to the edge of the floor and did not release her hand immediately. "You are not what I expected," he said, quietly. "What did you expect?" "Someone worn down." "I am worn down," she said. "I simply stopped letting it show when I realized no one was offering to help carry it." He looked at her for a long moment. "You were never broken, Mrs. Wycliffe," he said. "You were simply surviving people who wanted you to believe you were." Elspeth did not answer. She was not yet ready to receive that. But she did not argue with it either. And that, for the moment, was enough. The note was slipped under the door of Elspeth's cottage at 7 in the morning on a Thursday, folded twice and sealed with a plain wax disc, no signature. 3 lines only, written in a hand that pressed too hard on the paper, as people do when they are anxious. "I know what he did. I saw him with the papers. I am afraid, but I am more afraid of dying with it unsaid. Tell me where to come." The note was unsigned, but the handwriting had a particular slope, a left-handed slant, that Elspeth recognized from a visiting card she had once received from a domestic servant at Brackley Hall, a young woman who had applied for a position in the Wycliffe household 2 years before Edmund died. Her name was Mabel Thorne. She was 24, a housemaid in the service of Sir Oswin Brackley, and she had plain features and rough, reddened hands and eyes that moved constantly to the door of any room she entered, the way eyes do when they have learned that safety can leave very quickly. Elspeth sent a brief, careful reply through the dressmaker in Harrogate, and 4 days later, Mabel arrived at the cottage just after dusk, wearing a plain grey wool cloak, pulled up over her face and carrying nothing, except a small cloth bag that held, she explained, the only evidence she had managed to keep without it being discovered. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that she did not drink, and she spoke. In the summer of 1882, she told them. The Duke had been sent for and arrived by the following morning. She had been polishing the grate in Sir Oswin's private study when she heard him return unexpectedly. She had hidden in the alcove behind the bookcase, too frightened to announce herself, and she had watched through a gap in the panelling as Sir Oswin stood at his desk and burned a series of documents. One by one, feeding them to the lamp flame with the steady patience of a man disposing of something he had planned to dispose of for some time. One paper had fallen from his hand before it reached the flame. He had not noticed. He left the room. Mabel had retrieved the paper. She drew it from the cloth bag now, smoothed flat and kept between two pieces of stiff card. It was a letter dated June 1882, signed by a doctor, Philip Creddy of Leeds, with a note in Sir Oswin's own hand at the margin. Death certificate to be amended. Inflammation of the heart will serve. No further inquiry expected. The name at the top of the letter was Dr. Edmund Wycliffe. Elspeth looked at the paper for a long time. Then she folded her hands in her lap, very carefully, the way she did when she needed to keep herself from shaking. "He did not die of a fever," she said. Her voice was completely steady. "No," said the Duke, from the chair across the table. He was silenced, and then they wrote the cause of death they needed him to have. Mabel Thorne looked between them. "I am sorry I waited so long," she whispered. "I was afraid of what he would do if he found out I had kept it." "You kept it for 5 years," Elspeth said quietly. "That was not cowardice, Mabel. That was courage that simply needed the right moment." That night, a man appeared outside Elspeth's cottage gate. The Duke's coachman saw him and sent word. The man disappeared before he could be confronted, but his presence confirmed what they already suspected. Sir Oswin knew they were close. Sir Oswin moved first. It was a Monday morning, and the news reached Elspeth through Lady Harrington, who arrived at the cottage in person, without announcement, with a face that was the colour of old chalk. Sir Oswin had presented, to the Yorkshire County Magistracy, a formal written declaration accusing Mrs. Elspeth Wycliffe of falsifying charitable account records in order to fraudulently reclaim the funds her late husband had stolen. He had attached to the declaration a set of documents, 3 pages of figures with Elspeth's name handwritten in the margins, annotated in what appeared to be her own script. They were forgeries. Elspeth knew it the moment she saw the copies Lady Harrington had managed to obtain. The handwriting was close, very close, but the letters K and W were formed differently from the way Elspeth had written them since she was 12. Years old, a habit her mother had corrected, and which had never fully changed. It would not be enough to simply say so. She sat in her kitchen for a long time after Lady Harrington left. The fear was not of prison. It was something quieter and more total. The fear of being believed again, of having the accusation pressed so firmly into the shape of her life that, this time, not even she could tell where it ended and where she began. She almost did not send for the Duke. She sent for him anyway. He arrived in under 2 hours, which told her something she was not yet ready to name. He came in without ceremony, saw her expression, and sat across the table with the documents spread between them. He read them carefully, then he set them down. "He is frightened," the Duke said. "He is powerful," Elspeth replied. "Those are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they often describe the same person at the same moment." He looked at her steadily. A man who is certain of his position does not forge documents at this stage. He waits. He lets the weight of reputation do his work for him. The fact that Oswin Brackley is forging evidence now means he knows something real is coming, and he is trying to outrun it. Elspeth looked at the papers. "The hearing will be before the full magistracy," she said. "He sits on that body. He will have allies in that room." "He will," the Duke agreed. "And so will you." He said it with a certainty that was not performed. Not the kind of reassurance people offer when they want the discomfort in the room to settle. It was the certainty of a man who had already thought 3 steps ahead and found them solid. Elspeth breathed. "Truth does not become weaker because liars shout louder," she said, half to him, half to herself. "No," he said. "It does not. It only becomes more necessary." The public hearing was held on the 29th of November, 1887, in the wood-panelled chamber of Hawthorne Court. Chosen, at the Duke's insistence, on neutral ground, rather than at the county magistracy offices where Oswin Brackley's influence ran deepest. 22 people were present, 6 magistrates, 4 solicitors, the county recorder, several witnesses, a handful of local dignitaries, and, in the second row, Lady Cordelia Fairborn, who had arrived early, taken the most visible seat available, and arranged her emerald silk skirts with the air of a woman who intended to be noticed. Elspeth sat at the front table, alone. The Duke was in the room but did not sit with her. He stood against the far wall in the dark, watchful still, and absolutely present in a way that required no proximity to be felt. Sir Oswin Brackley entered and took his seat among the magistrates with unhurried confidence of a man who believed this was already over. His silver hair was immaculate. His gold cufflinks caught the lamplight. His eyes moved briefly to Elspeth and then away, as though she were furniture. He presented his case methodically. The forged documents, witness statements from 2 men Elspeth had never met, who had, apparently, seen her in conversation with a solicitor in Leeds, a character testimony from a vicar who described her with theatrical sorrow as a woman long consumed by bitterness. The performance was polished. Several magistrates were nodding. Then Sir Oswin concluded with a smile that suggested he was being gracious in his victory. "Mrs. Wycliffe has caused enough harm to enough innocent people," he said. "It is time this county drew a line under the matter." He sat down. The presiding magistrate turned to Elspeth. She stood. She did not have notes. She did not need them. She had rehearsed nothing, because she had decided that the only language she could trust in this room was the one she had been speaking for 5 years. The language of precise, unadorned truth. She began with Mabel Thorne. Mabel was brought in from the anteroom, pale but upright, in a clean, dark dress and a plain bonnet. She took the witness chair and held her hands together in her lap and told the room what she had seen in Sir Oswin's study in the summer of 1882. She produced the letter from Dr. Philip Creddy. She did not waver on a single detail. Sir Oswin rose to object 3 times. Each time he was told to sit. Then Elspeth called Mr. Wilfrid Pargeter. He came in looking precisely as she remembered, thin, pale, spectacles sliding down his nose, the particular gait of a man, walking toward something he had been dreading for years and had finally run out of road to escape. He sat down. He adjusted his spectacles. He looked at Sir Oswin Brackley, who looked back at him with an expression that was meant to be warning and was instead merely the face of a man realizing the wall behind him had ceased to be solid. Mr. Pargeter confessed. All of it, his role as witness to the false contracts. The payments routed through the fictitious accounts. The conversation he had overheard between Sir Oswin and Dr. Creddy in July of 1882, where the decision was made to ensure that Dr. Wycliffe would not be in a position to present his findings to the fund's trustees. He was, he said, very aware that he had waited too long. He said it twice. Then the Duke crossed the room. He placed the hidden ledger on the recorder's table and set beside it 3 letters written in Sir Oswin's own hand, recovered from the late Sir Reginald Moss's estate. Then he laid down the locket, Edmund's locket, with its 4 words inside, and Rosamund's blood-stained locket beside it. And he stood back and let the room look. And then Elspeth did the last thing. She opened Edmund's green account ledger, the one she had kept through 5 years and 2 house moves, and every moment when she thought about burning it, because looking at his handwriting was more than she could manage. And she read aloud the entry from February 1882. Relief Fund accounts reviewed. Discrepancies confirmed. Names identified. Evidence to be presented to trustees on the 14th inst. God help them if it does not reach the right hands. It had not reached the right hands. Not then. It was reaching them now. The chamber was completely silent. Sir Oswin Brackley looked, for the first time in 40 years of public life, like a man with no more exits. The verdict was not immediate. These things never are. They require the careful preservation of procedure, even when the truth is obvious, which is the legal system's way of reminding everyone that it moves on its own terms. But within a fortnight it came. Sir Oswin Brackley was stripped of his magistracy and formally charged with embezzlement, falsification of records, and conspiracy in the unlawful alteration of a death certificate. His legal counsel was considerable, but the evidence was more considerable, and the two men he had paid to testify against Elspeth retracted their statements with such speed that it created a small scandal of its own. He would face trial in the spring. The county knew it. His wife had gone to stay with her sister in Bath. The gold cufflinks appeared in a Leeds pawnbroker's window by December. Mr. Wilfrid Pargeter, having confessed fully and assisted the recovery of documentation, was not charged with embezzlement, but was censured formally and required to make restitution from his own modest savings. He did so without argument. He also, in a letter to Elspeth, apologized at considerable length and with what appeared to be genuine contrition. The letter was 6 pages. Elspeth read it twice, folded it, and put it away. She did not reply, but she did not tear it up either. Dr. Philip Creddy of Leeds surrendered his medical license. The £420, with interest calculated from 1882, was ordered to be restored to the Relief Fund, now placed under independent oversight with published accounts, an appointed external auditor, and a board that included 2 representatives of the mill workers' communities themselves. Lady Cordelia Fairborn, who had sat in that second row in her emerald silk and watched every moment of the hearing, used her formidable social influence in the following weeks to ensure that the restoration of the fund was publicly celebrated rather than quietly managed. She also made it her personal project to ensure that certain letters of condemnation about Elspeth Wycliffe, which had been circulating in society drawing rooms for 5 years, were countered with something rather more accurate. Lady Harrington wept when Elspeth told her. Mabel Thorne was offered a permanent position in the household of the Duchess of Hawthorne, a title that did not yet exist, but which the Duke had informed his steward he intended to create in the near future. And Edmund Wycliffe's name was cleared by formal county declaration, entered into the public record, and read aloud at the next session of the magistracy by a justice who had the particular grace to sound genuinely sorry that it had taken 5 years to happen. Elspeth received the news in the sitting-room at Hawthorne House, where she had been working with the Duke on the final arrangements for the fund's restoration. The steward brought the document. She read it standing up by the window with the autumn light coming in grey and even over the moor. She did not make a sound. She stood there for a long moment, and then her shoulders released. Just slightly, just barely, the way a person exhales after holding their breath for 5 years. The Duke was across the room. He saw it. He crossed to her, and for the second time in Elspeth Wycliffe's life, she watched the Duke of Hawthorne lower himself to one knee before her. This time, there was no ballroom, no audience, no agenda. There was only the grey light and the sound of the moor wind, and a man who had spent 3 years investigating a crime and somewhere in the process had begun to understand something about himself that he had not expected. "I have practiced several versions of this," he said. All of them were worse than saying it plainly. "Then say it plainly," Elspeth told him. "I love you," he said. "Not because of what you have endured. Not because you helped me find justice for my sister, though I am grateful for both beyond my ability to express. I love you because you are the most clear-eyed, courageous, and quietly devastating person I have ever encountered, and I would consider it the greatest privilege of my life if you would agree to spend the rest of it beside me." Elspeth looked at him. She thought of all the years she had spent becoming a woman who expected nothing. She thought of Edmund, who had loved her quietly and died before she was ready. She thought of the ballroom at Ravensmere Hall and Sir Oswyn's soft, destroying voice and the 30 people who had looked away. She thought about how very long it had taken for the right thing to arrive. "Get up, Alaric," she said gently. He rose. "Yes," she said. Obviously yes. He kissed her once, carefully, with the concentrated attention of a man who understood that certain things, once begun, deserve to be done properly. Outside the window, the first snow of the season had begun to fall across the moor of Hawthorne. It was, by any measure, a perfect morning. And here we are, noble viewers, standing at the threshold where justice has been served, love has been found, and truth has finally been allowed its proper voice. If Elspeth's story moved something in you, if you found yourself leaning forward during the hearing or holding your breath when Mabel walked in, or quietly hoping that a duke would say the right thing at the right moment, then this story has done exactly what it was made to do. We would be deeply honored if you would subscribe to Forbidden Palace, leave a like upon this video, and share it with someone who believes that love is still possible and justice still comes, even when it is very, very late. Tell us in the comments, did Elspeth deserve everything she received? And do you believe Edmund knew, in whatever quiet place good men go, that she finally got it? Your presence here is not taken for granted. Every comment, every like, and every new subscriber reminds us why these stories are worth telling. Now let us bring this to its proper close. And so the woman they called too old, too poor, and too broken became the woman they were forced to honor. Sir Oswyn Brackley stood trial the following spring. He was convicted on all charges. He lost his title of magistrate. His properties were placed under legal seizure pending restitution. And he retired from public life into the kind of quiet that is not peace, but merely the absence of people willing to listen. The county did not mourn his fall. Several people who had laughed at Ravensmere Hall sent letters of apology to Elspeth that were so carefully worded as to be almost impressive in their cowardice. She read each one, placed it in the fire, and felt nothing she had not already decided to feel. Mr. Wilfrid Pargeter moved to a small town in Shropshire and took a position as a clerk in a draper's shop. He was, by all accounts, an extremely punctual employee. His spectacles still slid down his nose when he was nervous, but there was, at last, very little to be nervous about. Dr. Philip Creddy never practiced medicine again. He wrote a memoir that no one published. Lady Cordelia Fairborn became the patron of the Reorganized Relief Fund and delivered an address at its first public assembly that was quoted, in part, in 3 newspapers, and which contained the sentence: "Charity without accountability is merely generosity to one's own convenience." She had it embroidered on a cushion and placed in her drawing-room, where it made several guests visibly uncomfortable. Mabel Thorne worked in the household at Hawthorne House for 30 years and became, in time, the head housekeeper. A position she held with the same quiet precision and the same watchful eyes, only now the door she monitored was one she managed rather than one she feared. Lady Harrington attended the wedding and wept through the entirety of the vows, which she had written herself to reflect what she called the appropriate poetic gravity of the occasion. The Duke bore it with admirable patience. Elspeth squeezed her hand through the 3rd paragraph. And Elspeth Wycliffe, who had entered a ballroom 5 years earlier in a borrowed gown, and nearly not survived the evening, walked out of Hawthorne Chapel on a December morning as the Duchess of Hawthorne. With Edmund's locket resting against her collarbone and the Duke's hand warm against hers and snow falling, for the second time that winter, across the moor. The Duke had said on the morning he proposed the words she had needed for 5 years. "You were never ruined, my love. They were simply too blind to see you." She believed him, not because she needed to, not because it was easier, but because it was true, and she had earned, at considerable cost, the right to know the difference. Lessons from the story reputation is not the same as truth. A public accusation, delivered with enough confidence and social authority, can destroy an innocent person without a single day in court. Victorian England knew this well, and so does the world today. Always ask who benefits from a particular story being told, and who suffers when no one questions it. Charitable organizations require accountability. Money gathered in the name of the vulnerable is not a private resource. Without independent oversight, published accounts, and external scrutiny, charity becomes opportunity for those who know how to use silence. The mill workers of the Calder Valley paid for that silence with 5 years of resources they should have received. Age is not diminishment. Elspeth Wycliffe, at 49, was not a lesser version of a younger woman. She was a woman whose years had given her patience, precision, and the kind of composed courage that only comes from having survived things that were supposed to break her. Older does not mean finished. It means forged. Silence protects the wrong people. Mabel Thorne kept a secret for 5 years out of fear. During those 5 years, the man she feared continued undisturbed. When she spoke, everything changed. This is the nature of difficult truths. They do not become less true when we withhold them. They simply keep doing damage in the dark. Love that honors dignity is worth waiting for. Alaric Pembroke did not love Elspeth in spite of her circumstances. He loved her because of who she had remained inside them. Clear-eyed, honest, undefeated. The best love is not rescue. It is recognition. Justice is slow but not impossible. It took 5 years. It required a maid who kept a piece of paper, a duke who refused to stop looking, a frightened clerk who finally found his voice, and a woman who had every reason to give up and chose, every single day, not to. That is not a fairy tale. That is what justice actually looks like when real people do the unglamorous work of pursuing it.